Thank you so much for being here tonight. We are in the middle of our study of the 12 apostles. And I say the middle because tonight we will study numbers 5 and 6 that we have gotten to in our study so far. Thus far we've hit on Peter, Andrew, James, and John. Many considered to be the leaders, or at least the most prominent ones of the group. They are mentioned more than almost any other of the apostles in the Bible, in the New Testament that is. Peter often given the credit of being the quote-unquote leader of the group. Tonight we are moving on to Philip and Nathaniel. We are going to accelerate the study just a little bit because we start to get fewer and fewer references as we get further down the list. I do want to reserve 2 studies for the very end of this quarter, and that's going to bring us up to, I believe, May the 1st will be our last class period for this one, this study in particular. So tonight we're studying Philip and Nathaniel. Next week the plan will be to cover Matthew the tax collector, Simon the zealot, Judas not Iscariot, and James the Less. So we'll cover all 4 of those next week, and then we'll be up to, I believe, singing week after that. Nope, I take it back. Then we'll have one more study. We're going to spend a whole week on Judas. I think there are lots of nuances to talk about with Judas. There are lots of opinions on Judas, but we want to spend a week on that. And then we'll have our singing week. And then our final study in this lesson of the 12 apostles, or this study, will be on the apostle Thomas. I believe, again, a great way to kind of bring it all together. Thomas unites a lot of the qualities and also brings us some interesting stories where he is quoted interacting with Jesus and the others. So tonight, Philip and Nathaniel. I went to the dentist this morning. This has nothing to do with Philip, by the way. I went to the dentist this morning. It was cleaning time. Got my teeth all clean. Manny gets mad at me. Never had a cavity. 27 years old. Never had a cavity. I'm also lying in the church house, but if I say I'm lying, it's not a lie. Okay, never had a cavity. Manny gets mad at me because I am not the, what's the word I'm looking for? Consistent dental hygiene person that she is. I brush, and I brush twice a day. But Mandy is a brusher, flosser, rinser, sometimes throw in it again just for fun. And bless her teeth, they just, we blame Kyle. They shared a womb. We think that Kyle must have done something. Anyway, I went to the dentist this morning. And I brush, right? Clean. Well, this woman's in there scraping, 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 scraping. She keeps wiping it off and wiping it off. Like, how in the world could you have so much stuff to scrape off my teeth that I brush every day? I even brushed them right before I went this morning, which, again, my wife makes fun of me, but I don't want to breathe coffee breath on that person right in my face. Okay, here's the deal. So I'm sitting there. This is what John Bates' mind does. I'm sitting there. I'm going, this is kind of like going to church. I can study my Bible every day. And I'm going to admit, I don't do that. I'm not good at keeping that pattern. I can study my Bible every day. But if I don't get here to the church building, I'm not getting all that stuff scraped off. So let's come together and let's scrape the tartar off. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. But seriously, there is benefit to being here. You can study that Bible all you want. You can worship behind a Zoom screen if you want to. But if you're not here, you don't get the high fives and the fist bumps and the stupid dad jokes that I'm going to tell after class is over. Because I wouldn't do that during class. Right. But come and join us. Keep coming. Don't stay away. This is where you get cleaned up and ready to go until the next time we get together. Philip and Nathaniel. The next pair of our apostles. They are closely associated in the New Testament accounts. They are often mentioned together, similar to like James or John or Peter and Andrew, except that they are never related biologically. We never get an idea that they are brothers. But they are at least acquaintances, likely close friends, and perhaps even co-workers. They grew up in the area of Bethsaida, which, if you remember our previous studies, was the same place that Peter and Andrew grew up. For that matter, in John 1:44, it says that Philip from Bethsaida, which is the city of Peter and Andrew, that's John 1:44. So it's very likely that they even grew up in the very same synagogue where they were studying Scripture together. We have already discussed the idea that likely Peter and Andrew were knowledgeable of the prophets, knowledgeable of the old law. That's what drove them to be so accepting of Jesus as the Messiah. They knew that he was coming. And very likely Philip grew up in that same location, perhaps even studying under the same teachers and maybe even being acquaintances with Peter and Andrew. We don't know that for sure, but it is very likely because that was not a big area. Side note, as we get into this study of Philip and Nathaniel, Nathaniel is the same man also referred to as Bartholomew. That Bartholomew that we often use, and he's called Bartholomew in all of the listings that you see of the 12, that's likely his surname, Bartholomew, which is son of Tholomew, or the Hebrew term Ptolemy is what is often thought to be the reference there. So perhaps his name was actually Nathaniel bar Ptolemy, son of Ptolemy, but for unclear reasons, those names are used interchangeably in the New Testament to refer to this very same character. Interesting facts. Let's start with Philip and his interesting facts. There are some unique qualities to Philip specifically in that his name is Philip. There is nothing Hebrew about that name. That is a Greek name, Philip. But we know he is a Jew, yet he has a Greek name. Well, why might that be? Have you heard of a small character in history known as Alexander the Great? Obviously, that entire area of the world was at one time ruled by those who spoke Greek. And it is likely that Philip and his family were among what we later refer to as the Hellenistic Jews. They were Jewish people that grew up in a Greek culture. And likely for that reason, Philip is given a Greek name. We suspect that Philip also had a Hebrew name, but it's never mentioned in the New Testament, so that is speculation. Here is a fun fact. Now this has, I think, little to do with our spiritual depth of Philip here, but his name means lover of horses. So there's that. Okay. They may have been Hellenistic Jews, originally from Bethsaida, as I've already mentioned. Also, Philip likely was a fisherman. He is not to be confused with Philip the deacon mentioned in Acts chapter 7. The same Philip that then went to preach in Acts chapter 8 to the Ethiopian eunuch. That is not the same Philip. That is a different Philip. Both good guys, apparently. And he was probably familiar with Peter, Andrew, James, and John, maybe even a co-worker with them. There is the account between the crucifixion of Jesus and the resurrection of Jesus, where Peter says, "I'm going fishing." And approximately 6 of the other disciples joined him. Andrew, James, John, I believe Nathaniel is listed in that, and Philip is implied. So it's very likely they all went fishing together right after the death of Jesus, as that was their way of blowing off steam, if you will. That's John chapter 21, verse 2. Thomas and Nathaniel are the ones, I should have said, I'm sorry, that are mentioned going fishing with Peter. So at this point we have approximately 7 of the 12 apostles that are all from the same geographic area with the same profession that were potentially at least somewhat associated prior to becoming part of the 12 apostles. How strange. Remember at the beginning of our study here, we talked about how these were not men of renown. These were not men of great learning. These were not men who had positions of power or honor or glory. They were random guys. I say that through humanistic eyes. They were random guys. They weren't random guys. Jesus chose them on purpose. But they were as plain Jane as you and me walking down the street out here. But here are 7 of them. Part of me is really curious as to the synagogue culture they grew up in. Really curious as to perhaps the rabbis that they sat at the feet of. Really curious as to how those spiritual leaders may have accepted Jesus. We know that Jesus commonly was not accepted in that Galilean region. In his own area of Capernaum and Nazareth, he was rejected. They ran him up to the bluff to throw him off. And one of my favorite stories, he walked through them and left. I don't know how that happens. This is amazing to me. So 7 of the 12 likely were already closely associated. All of the information recorded for us about Philip comes exclusively from John's gospel account. Perhaps that is because of John's familiarity with Philip. We really don't know. But let's start at the beginning. Philip's calling, we'll say. Philip is the first of the apostles that we are recorded getting a specific call from Jesus. And the language used here in John chapter 1 is unique. If you will turn there, John chapter 1, we're in verses 43 through 45. This event happens immediately after John the Baptist identified Jesus as the Lamb of God, which is why I chose that song to sing tonight. John the Baptist, if you may remember in John chapter 1, as Jesus walks by, this was after his baptism, but he walks by them and he points them out and says, "There's the Lamb of God." And if you'll remember our previous studies, I lost my note there. Andrew and John got up and followed him. Andrew went to find somebody. John may have found James. We're not really told that, but we know that those brothers were brought in. But here's where we're going to pick up in verse 43. So Andrew and John, and likely Peter, and maybe James, all sat with Jesus for a day and listened to him. And in verse 43, John writes, "The next day, Jesus decided to go to Galilee. He found Philip and said to him," or some translations say he sought Philip, almost like he searched him out specifically. I told you these were not random choices, right? He found Philip, almost like he'd been looking for him, and said to him, "Follow me." Now Philip was from Bethsaida, the city of Andrew and Peter. Before anything else happens, before Philip says, "Yes, Lord," before Philip says, "I believe in you," what is the very next sentence? Philip found Nathaniel and said to him, "We have found him of whom Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph." This is the first account of Jesus actually seeking out a particular individual. I have my suspicions that he walked by that gathering of John the Baptist and Andrew and John on purpose. But this is the first account where it's made even clearer that he potentially was seeking out these individuals specifically. Similar to Andrew, upon being called by Jesus, Philip immediately went to his potentially closest acquaintance, Nathaniel, to tell him the good news. And what did he say? Come and see. Come and see. Thank you, Andrew, for that great example. Thank you, Philip, for repeating the very same example. Come and see. If you get nothing else from this quarter of study, just do what the apostles did. Come and see. Come and see. Philip's immediate response stands in contrast to his portrayal later in the gospel, where he is shown to be a man of practicality and process. Well, that's just not possible, Lord. That's just not possible. We're going to talk about that in just a minute. But in this moment, when Jesus seeks him out, and he finds him, and he says, "Follow me," Philip goes, "Hey, Nathaniel, we found him. Come on, let's go." And he gets up and he goes. This tells us a lot about Philip. He obviously knew something about Moses, the law, that is. He knew that the law was pointing to something. He also obviously knew something about the prophets. He knew that they were telling of something greater. I mean, the very promise to Abraham itself, which is what all of Judaism was founded on, was this promise of something to bless the whole world. So by saying what he did to Nathaniel, "We have found him of whom Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote," and then he identifies him. It's one of the clearest definitions of Jesus as that Messiah, that chosen one, that Christ. We have found him. Oh, and by the way, who is it, Nathaniel? It's Jesus of Nazareth, son of Joseph. I am moved by the eagerness of Philip's response. Likewise, Nathaniel's response, as we will get to in just a little bit, was immediate, yet he had questions. We don't have any recordings of Philip's questions here, but Nathaniel had a few questions. But Philip's response was immediate, and it was to bring along his friend, which implies also that Nathaniel likely knew what he was talking about. He knew the law. He knew the prophets. And maybe because these two men grew up together in the same area, perhaps in the same synagogue, studying under the same people, perhaps this was a point of frequent conversation. They were looking. They weren't just sitting on the street corner, and Jesus walked by and they said, "I think that's the Messiah." They were looking. They were eager to find him. And when he presented himself, they knew it. So let's talk about some of that practicality that I mentioned with Philip. And we see that in the few places that Philip is referenced in the gospel accounts. So specifically in John chapter 6, as I said, all of Philip's recordings are in the Gospel of John. John chapter 6, verses 1 through 7, this is the feeding of the 5,000. And I'm going to read just the first 7 verses of the passage here. After this, Jesus went away to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias, and a large crowd was following him because they saw the signs that he was doing on the sick. Jesus went up on the mountain, and there he sat down with his disciples. Now the Passover, the feast of the Jews, was at hand. Lifting up his eyes then, and seeing that a large crowd was coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, doesn't say to the 12, Doesn't say to Peter. He says to Philip, where are we to buy bread so that these people may eat? And John goes on to then give a little bit of insight into what Jesus is doing here. He said this to test him, for he himself knew what he would do. Jesus already knew what he was going to do. But he said this to test Philip. Now, did he say it to test Philip to make him feel like a failure? Did he say it to test Philip to see if he would give the answer that Jesus was going to give? Did he say it to test Philip for any reason other than for Philip to see who Philip was? That is John Bates' opinion. Philip answered him, and this is why I refer to Philip as a man of practicality. Philip answered, 200 denarii worth of bread would not be enough for each of them to get a little. 200 denarii would have been a large sum of money for this group of at least 7 of the 12 fishermen. That was a large sum of money. And he says 200 denarii would not even be enough for each of these people to get a little bit. Here is what is strange about this response from Philip. Other than Philip is a normal person with normal physical understanding who is going to give the same answers that you and I may give when faced with what seems like an impossible task. This happened shortly after the account of the wedding feast at Cana. This happened after Philip had been witness to Jesus having them fill large barrels with water and drawing out the sweetest wine that had yet been served at that wedding. Now, likely there were even other miracles that had been done. We were just seeing here that these people were following Jesus because he was healing the illnesses. Philip was seeing these wonderful and great things, but even Philip placed a limit on what he thought Jesus could do. Well, I mean, come on now. Well, we can't buy food for all these people. Jesus said this to test him. Jesus wanted Philip to reveal himself. Maybe it was for Philip to reveal himself to Jesus. Maybe it was for Philip to reveal himself to himself. And I tend to be on the latter side of that. I think Jesus wanted Philip to see himself for who he was, or for at least where his thoughts were. And while he was convinced that Jesus was the Christ, as soon as Jesus said, "Follow me," up and at him he went. He still had trouble understanding what exactly that meant. He is the Christ. He is the chosen one. He is part of the Godhead himself, who is omniscient, omnipresent. And yet, he did not see how they could feed this group. Perhaps this is a reassurance to those of us in 2024 that find ourselves with strong faith on some days and weak on others. Because Philip was certainly very strong when Jesus said, "Follow me. And I'm going to go get Nathaniel and come along too." But he was not so strong when Jesus said, "Hey, where are we going to get bread to feed these people?" And it just lets us see how God can use our physical limitation, can teach us through it, but needs to get us past it. Philip needed to see who Jesus really was. Now, if you remember in our study of Andrew, Andrew was then the one who brings the young boy with 5 loaves and 2 fishes. And he says, "I found this boy." Andrew was bringing someone to Jesus. He had no idea how these 5 loaves and 2 fish were going to feed the whole crowd. He said, "I found this boy, he's got 5 loaves and 2 fish, but what is that among a crowd of this size?" He found what he could. And so we learn that while Andrew may not still have understood it, he found what he could. And Jesus worked with it. So Philip, a man of practicality, limited by what he thought the power of Christ might be in this situation, limited by his understanding of what Jesus' actual reach could be here. Second example of Philip, the practical man. Some would call him a man of process. So Philip being a man with a Greek name, there is another recording of him in John chapter 12, where some Greeks who are interested in meeting Jesus come to him specifically. Maybe it is because he had a Greek name. Maybe they knew him from whatever their families were involved together. We don't know that part. But in John chapter 12, verse 20, "Now among those who went up to worship at the feast were some Greeks. So these came to Philip, who was from Bethsaida in Galilee, and asked him, 'Sir, we wish to see Jesus.' And Philip took them to Jesus." No, that's not what the Bible says. Philip, the man of process, who had heard Jesus say already, "Take this message to the children of Israel. Take this message to those of the house of Israel," knew that these were not Jewish people. And so he was conflicted. He wants people to come meet Jesus. He brought Nathaniel to meet Jesus, but he's not sure what to do with him. So he goes to Andrew. Hey, Andrew, what do you think we should do? And Andrew, the great inviter, says, let's go. And Andrew takes Philip by the hand, and they walk these young men up to Jesus. And we're grateful for Andrew for doing that. Philip gave pause here. Now, I don't want to read too much into that. Maybe he was indeed just trying to figure out how to get these people to Jesus. Where is Jesus, Andrew? But it does seem that he took some pause there. Philip didn't immediately grant their request, but he went to Andrew, maybe just asking his opinion. But he seemed to be looking for someone else to approve this meeting. And then our final story of Philip is probably one of the most heartbreaking. Not because anything bad happened to him, but because, just like Peter, it's almost like he had denied the very Godhead of Jesus himself. And this is found in John chapter 14. This is in the upper room. We're here having our Last Supper with the disciples. And Jesus is giving, these final words of wisdom. They've spent now quite a little bit of time together, and he's seen miracle after miracle, and he's seen Lazarus raised from the dead, and he's been right there with God himself. And Jesus says in chapter 14, verse 6, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. If you had known me, you would have known my Father also. From now on, you do know him and have seen him. Philip said to him, Lord, show us the Father. Did you hear what Jesus just said? If you had known me, you would have known my Father also. From now on, you do know him and have seen him. Philip says, Lord, show us the Father, and it is enough for us. Even now, after 2.5 years of following around the Son of God, who has raised the dead, who has healed the sick, who has made the blind to see, the lame to walk, who has just told them what is going to happen. He's going to be raised up, he's going to be killed, he's going to rise again on the third day. And he says, basically equating himself with the Father, guys, I am God. And if you've seen me, you have seen God. They hadn't just seen him, they'd embraced him. He had washed their feet. If you've seen me, you've seen him. And Philip says, oh, but Jesus, just show us the Father. Do you think Jesus shook his head for a second? Do you think maybe he paused and he's, what have I been doing for the last 2.5 years? No, I don't think Jesus really did. I think he knew exactly what he was doing. But I think this is a heartbreaking expression of how weak our human hearts can be. As eager as Philip was to follow when Jesus said, follow me, as eager as he was to bring Nathaniel along for the ride and say, we found the man, the one that Moses spoke of, that the prophet spoke of, he still didn't quite get it. That Jesus was himself God in flesh. And so if I sit here and think, man, if Jesus walked by me and said, follow, I'd jump on that too. No, maybe I wouldn't have. I am just as likely to have discredited him as the next guy, because everybody that grew up with him sure did. Those that led the nation of Israel sure wanted to discredit him. And so Philip is a reminder that my faith, even at its best days, can fail. And that's why we depend on Jesus. Jesus doesn't scold him, not harshly at least. Jesus doesn't send him out and say, go away from me. Get behind me, Satan. Oh, wait, he did say that to Peter. Peter needed that, though, Peter's the kid that you probably need to spank him like third or fourth time before he finally got it. Philip needed a little more gentle correction. Jesus said to him, have I been with you so long, and you still do not know me, Philip? Whoever has seen me has seen the Father. How can you say, show us the Father? Do you not believe that I am in the Father, and the Father is in me? The words that I say to you, I do not speak on my own authority, but the Father who dwells in me does his works. Believe me that I am in the Father, and the Father is in me, or else believe on account of the works themselves. Jesus said, how can you say that, Philip? Have you heard anything I said? Philip was quick to accept the calling, but even after 3 years, he still wanted Jesus to show him the Father. Jesus rebukes him, but he clarifies and really makes, again, one of the clearest statements in all of Scripture. I am God, and God is me. I always like to give at least what traditional church history tells us about the apostles after the New Testament account, because we are given such limited pictures. So it is interesting to hear what's recorded. Tradition records that Philip evangelized widely, mostly in the Palestine, Mediterranean area, maybe up into Asia Minor. And reportedly, he was stoned to death in Heliopolis, which is in Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey, just about 8 years after James, potentially the second of the 12 apostles to lose his life for Christ's sake. And as we've talked about over and over, yes, 10 of the 12 were martyred for Christ's sake. Judas took his own life, which we'll get to. I know I spoiled that lesson for you already. And John lived to a very old age on the island of Patmos. Let's move to Nathaniel. Nathaniel has really one passage in all of Scripture, other than being listed as Bartholomew in the listing of the 12. Nathaniel, interesting facts for him, he was from Cana of Galilee, which was the area where the water was turned to wine. He was also known as Bartholomew. He's only mentioned outside of the listing of the 12 twice. I misspoke, sorry. My notes say 12 twice. I don't know what that means. Likely a fisherman and a close companion of Philip. As we read earlier, Philip found Nathanael and said to him, "We have found him of whom Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph." And here's where we meet Nathanael. Nathanael said to him, I love this statement, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" Many scholars believe this to be a geographic rivalry. I mean, Cana was nothing special. Cana was even less special than Nazareth. Nazareth was on a crossroads, and people had to pass through it. Now, as you may know, I think of it kind of like a truck stop. Not always your highest society characters at the truck stop. And that's kind of what Nazareth was. Well, Cana was one of those places you couldn't get there from here. So Cana is being like, well, first you go down to Reeves and you turn, and then you cut through, and then, oh no, it doesn't go that way. And then, if you get a helicopter, Cana, you can't get there from here. So why in the world is he looking down on Nazareth other than maybe they played football together in high school or something? I don't know. We talked about the Gunnersville Wildcats as the River Rats because they were down on the Tennessee River and we were up on the mountain in Arab, Alabama. That's all that scholars can come up with, because other than Nazareth being a crossroads, it certainly was higher on the list than Cana. And so Nathaniel says in his very first revelation that Jesus of Nazareth is the one we're looking for, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" And Philip said to him, "Come and see." Come and see. So Jesus saw Nathanael coming toward him and said of him, "Behold, an Israelite indeed, in whom there is no deceit." Whoa. Thanks, Jesus. That's real nice of you. Nathanael said to him, "How do you know me?" Jesus answered him, "Before Philip called you, when you were under the fig tree, I saw you." And before we get to the rest of that, let's talk about that first statement that Jesus made. "Behold, an Israelite indeed, in whom there is no deceit. How do you know me?" Jesus could have been a couple of things. He may have simply meant a man of very sincere heart. And probably to some degree that is what he meant. Clearly, this man was seeking. This man was a student of the law. He was a student of the prophets. He was seeking the Messiah, and he was doing it sincerely. But also, he says, an Israelite indeed, maybe a true Jew. Not a Jew just in the lineage of Abraham or Israel, but a true Jew, a member of spiritual Israel, as we read throughout the New Testament, a member of Abraham's spiritual family, an Israelite indeed. What a wonderful compliment. Thanks, Jesus. I'm a little overwhelmed right now. Perhaps Nathanael was being referred to as the spiritual seed of Abraham. Either way, Jesus sees something good in Nathanael. He follows this wonderful compliment with a quick miraculous insight into Nathanael's movements. Nathanael was under the fig tree. A simple revelation was enough to stimulate a great confession. Really, a confession recorded before Peter ever thought it. What does Nathanael say? "Rabbi, you are the Son of God." What did Peter say? "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." This is only the second guy, as far as we know, that has been brought into the fold. "You are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel." Jesus answered him, "Because I said to you, I saw you under the fig tree. Do you believe? You will see greater things than these." And he said to him, "Truly, truly, I say to you, you will see heaven opened and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man." What a fantastic confession. From a man that we know very little about as far as what happens to him throughout the New Testament, we really get no further stories about him other than this encounter with Jesus, where he is called an Israelite indeed, in whom there is no deceit. I would sure love Jesus to say that about me. I don't think that he could say that about me. But he said it about Nathaniel, and even though Nathaniel came to him with this sort of prejudice of, we'll see what came out of Nazareth, I'll be the judge of that. He came anyway, probably because he trusted Philip. And as soon as Jesus reveals himself with this miraculous gift, now the fig tree potentially is significant here. The fig trees were commonly planted around houses that were 1 or 2 room, stone brick, sometimes smoky because, the little wood burning stove inside. And so to get your fresh air, to have your place of solace, you had to get out of that house. And so these fig trees would grow 12 to 15 feet tall, and they had big broad leaves, and they would make fruit. And scholars have theorized that perhaps Nathaniel used this particular place as a place to study. Some think that perhaps that's where Philip found him. We're not told that specifically, but it is perhaps plausible.
Whatever it was, it had to be significant because it went from you're an Israelite, the good kind, the kind you can trust.
That's right.
to this fig tree, and he's like, "Oh, okay.
You caught me.
Oh, okay. You see me, don't you?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay. You are the Son of God." So something happened under the fig tree that.
Yeah. It was convincing to Nathaniel that Jesus had seen him in this secret place, that only Nathaniel would have known what he had been doing there. And it was enough to convince him that this was indeed the Son of God, which he also interpreted correctly through the prophets, that you are the King of Israel. Those are often recorded in separate prophecies, but Nathaniel links them together. Yes, sir.
What always looked at this and considering of all this story or any other is the saying that he found them. He didn't.
Mm-hmm.
He already knew where they were.
Mm-hmm.
He just went to there.
That's right.
to complete what he had in mind for them.
That's right. That goes very much in line with our discussion tonight. While Jesus found them, he already knew where they were. It's like he just plugged in, dropped a pin on his Google Maps. It's, oh, there's Nathaniel. I'm going to go get him. He found him. We don't have much in church tradition on what happens to Nathaniel after the New Testament. There are some competing stories out there, except that he was martyred sometime during the 1st century. One tradition says he was tied up in a bag and drowned in the sea. Another was that he was crucified. Either way, how terrible. But no matter, his conviction and his faith led to spreading of the gospel even at the cost of his own life. This could not have been an accident. Jesus was not a made-up story. His presence as the Son of God, his resurrection, could not have been made up for this many people to just literally die on that hill as they did. So even what you might call less significant members of the 12 demonstrate valuable ways that God used ordinary people to accomplish his extraordinary task. The gospel was revealed and taught primarily by these disciples. And what an impact it's had. Maybe some were too practical. Thank you, Philip. Thank you for pinching the pennies and telling us that we can't afford to feed these people. Maybe others were geographically prejudiced. Well, what can come out of, I don't want to say anybody's town because that would be offensive. What can come out of Alabama, right? What was that? 65 North. That's right. Thank you. There's a country boy band called 65 South. Look them up sometimes. But instruments in the hand of the Christ. These men literally turned the world upside down. Next week, we have Matthew the publican, Simon the zealot, Judas not Iscariot, also known as Thaddeus, and James the Less. Please